Hello everyone, and welcome back to the fourth and final module of Chapter 10. So as I've mentioned in the past couple classes, this module is going to focus on adulthood and aging. So we're going to talk very briefly, there's only 7 or 8 slides for this section, on adulthood and some of the kind of major things that might occur and stages that we might face in terms of our development in adulthood and older age. So the time between adolescence and adulthood is filled with challenges and growth. And as I mentioned last class, we tend to call this phase now emerging adulthood. That is kind of a newer term, but it basically refers to that period between the ages of about 18 to 24. And at that point in life, those emerging adults are facing many adaptive challenges. There are 3 major areas of personal growth that are very important in the life of an emerging adult. They include relationships, new possibilities, and personal strengths. And we see that these correspond to relatedness, autonomy, and competence, which are widely viewed as key pillars of healthy development. So there's a lot going on at that point in life, and there's a lot there to accomplish. Finding a partner, if you feel like you'd like a partner in your life, finding a job, finding kind of a sense of purpose, all of those things start to kind of come to the light in this stage of development. However, the first few decades of early adulthood are typically the healthiest time of one's life. There is a sort of plateau period in terms of physical development. So after you reach that stage of puberty that we talked about in the last lecture, there's not a lot really new going on in your body for a very long time. I mean, basically the next major transition would be for females transitioning from menstruation to menopause. But really, at that kind of stage between, say, the ages of 25 and 45, 55, there's not a whole lot going on physically within the body. Around the age of 50, women experience menopause, which, as I kind of just mentioned, is the termination of the menstrual cycle and reproductive ability, which can result in symptoms such as hot flashes, reduced sex drive, and mood swings. Young adulthood is regarded by Erikson's theory as the stage during which the conflict of intimacy versus isolation must be resolved. And that kind of corresponds to what we talked about in the last slide, with relationships being a very big kind of focus of that stage of life. And so basically at that point, the major focus or crises that Erikson would say you have to resolve is finding a partner, finding someone to share your life with. The following stage, which would just be labeled adulthood, involves the tension of generativity versus stagnation. And that basically refers to whether you're going to become productively engaged with the world, you're going to be generative in terms of creating new things or new ideas. Honestly, sometimes people talk of generativity in terms of having children, kind of producing a being and teaching them what you know, passing on that knowledge. Whereas stagnation would basically be kind of just stagnating and failing to give back to the world in a meaningful way. So that's the major crisis that's involved with adulthood, is being productive, being generative, and making an impact. Again, here's the diagram of the stage theory, so you can kind of look at the different stages. And so you'll see now that we went through the first 4 stages, we talked about adolescence in the last module, and now we've just briefly touched on the young adulthood and the adulthood. So the only one we have left here is the aging. Consistent with Erikson's theory, being able to establish a committed long-term relationship seems to be good for people. So overall, people who are married, people who are in healthy relationships, they tend to fare better in terms of a lot of different outcomes. However, it is known that about 40% of Canadian marriages end in divorce. But one of the key factors that determines whether a marriage will end is something we have the most control over, which is how well partners are able to communicate with each other. So there is a researcher named Dr. John Gottman, and he identified what he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes to relationship breakup. He said that they were criticism, which is basically picking out flaws, defensiveness, which would be kind of responding to perceived attacks with counterattacks. So if someone says something not so nice to you, you kind of snap back at them. Contempt, which may be exhibited through eye rolls, sarcasm, and kind of a condescending tone of voice. And finally, stonewalling, which is kind of shutting down verbally and emotionally. So basically, he and a lot of researchers would agree that one of the key things to kind of keeping a relationship healthy and having a relationship that lasts is having an open and honest mode of communication that hopefully doesn't involve those four horsemen of the relationship apocalypse. Interestingly enough, late adulthood appears to be one of the happiest times in life. A lot of people say that, when they start to get older and start aging, they don't feel as though they're gonna feel as good about themselves anymore, but that actually tends to be the most contented time of life. We see that the emotional turmoil of youth gives way to a smoother, more emotionally stable, and generally more positive experience. So some developmental psychologists have proposed a socio-emotional selectivity theory, which basically describes how older people have learned to select for themselves more positive and nourishing experiences. So because they've been around for a while and they've kind of got the lay of the land, so to speak, they kind of understand how things work, they tend to actually be better at selecting experiences that they will find positive and that will impact them in a positive way. So the net result is that negative emotions often decline with age, while positive emotions increase in frequency. And then finally, Erikson's final stage, the ego integrity versus despair, involves the adult contemplating whether they have lived a full life and fulfilled major accomplishments. So that idea of, have I contributed something? Have I done what I wanted to do with my life? That would be kind of that final crisis that must be resolved at that last stage of life. Unfortunately, as much as we would love to avoid this topic, eventually the body does begin to decline, and the mind is typically not as sharp as it once was. So approximately 14% of people older than 71 years of age suffer from dementia, which is a mild to severe disruption of mental functioning, and may include memory loss, disorientation, poor judgment, and decision making. Nearly 10% of dementia cases also involve the more severe Alzheimer's disease, which I'm sure you've all heard of. So basically it's a degenerative and terminal condition resulting in severe damage to the entire brain, and it usually lasts from 7 to 10 years from onset to death. So basically, because of the eventual decline that is associated with Alzheimer's, it is considered a terminal condition in that respect. Alzheimer's disease involves a buildup of proteins that interrupt the function of neurons and another type of protein tangles within nerve cells. And I won't really get into that. It is kind of interesting, but it isn't a neuroscience course, and we did already talk a lot about the brain in the first course. But it has been linked to various changes within the brain. So again, I won't really get into this as much, but you can see here the difference that it would look like from like a normal brain to a brain that has been affected by Alzheimer's disease. So you see a buildup of protein called the beta amyloid, which actually kills the nerve cells, so it can kill your neurons. And the proteins that help structure the nerve cells, so structure the neurons, often become defective, and you get these little neurofibrillary tangles, which can interfere with your brain functioning as well. So different cognitive abilities seem to decline at varying rates. Performance on tasks that involve fluid intelligence tends to decline with age, while performance on tasks involving crystallized intelligence tends to remain fairly stable. So it is interesting, and we kind of talked about those two types of intelligence in the last chapter, and a little bit also when we talked about kind of memory and cognitive abilities in the last course. But basically, fluid intelligence refers to the ability to kind of learn new things and obtain new information, whereas crystallized intelligence tends to rely on the use of information and facts that you kind of already know, that you've already obtained. And so it is interesting that while you tend to retain what you already know in terms of your crystallized intelligence, you tend to lose the ability to kind of process and encode new information. And kind of learn new tasks and new ways of doing things. So overall, it is important to remember that older people actually retain their faculties much better than might be expected. So there is, a little bit of good news at the end of this chapter. There are many types of behaviors that might help prevent decline, such as staying physically active, practicing cognitively challenging activities, and eating a diet that's low in saturated fat and rich in antioxidants, omega-3 fatty acids, and B vitamins. So unfortunately, it is an inevitable fact of life that eventually we do get old and eventually we do pass away. But there are a lot of things that we can do to help preserve our health and preserve our cognitive abilities and hopefully allow us to lead as rich and fulfilling a life as possible. And that is the end of chapter 10. So this one was an even shorter module than the last. Not a whole lot to say about adulthood and aging. Of course, if this is a topic that interests you, you can definitely go on and take courses specific to the certain stages in terms of your development. A lot of developmental psychologists, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this chapter, tend to study childhood because it is the point at which the most changes occur most rapidly, but there are definitely whole courses dedicated to adolescence and adulthood and even kind of geriatric psychology as well. So I hope you enjoyed this chapter, and I will, I guess, talk to you in the next video where we'll be beginning chapter 11.